The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of distinguished guests gathered for the annual Royal Children's Charity Gala. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the sea of elegant evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. The cream of British society mingled with international dignitaries, all united in their support for children's causes worldwide. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, smoothed her midnight blue gown as she watched her youngest son, Prince Louis, fidget in his formal suit. At 8 years old, he was the picture of royal charm with his blonde hair neatly combed and his small bow tied perfectly straight. Tonight marked his first major public appearance at such a formal event, and Catherine could see both excitement and nervousness dancing in his bright blue eyes. "Remember what we practiced, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling down to his level. "Just speak from your heart when the time comes." Prince William stood nearby, adjusting his own formal attire while keeping a watchful eye on their son. The planned evening was meant to be a celebration of the royal family's commitment to children's welfare, with each family member scheduled to make brief remarks about causes close to their hearts. Louis had been preparing a simple speech about his favorite charity, one that provided toys to children in hospitals. The evening began smoothly enough. Princess Charlotte and Prince George had already delivered their speeches earlier in the program, earning warm applause from the appreciative audience. Charlotte spoke eloquently about environmental protection, while George shared his passion for aviation programs that inspired young people. Both had performed flawlessly, living up to their royal training and public expectations. Now, it was Louis's turn. The palace staff had worked with him for weeks, helping him memorize a safe, appropriate speech that would showcase the royal family's dedication to charitable work. The plan was simple. He would walk to the microphone, deliver his prepared remarks about bringing joy to sick children, and return to his seat amid polite applause. As the master of ceremonies announced Prince Louis, the young boy took a deep breath and walked confidently toward the podium. The audience settled into expectant silence. Hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on the small figure approaching the microphone. Photographers positioned themselves strategically, ready to capture what they assumed would be another charming moment in royal public relations. Catherine and William exchanged proud smiles as their son reached the podium. A small step stool had been placed behind it to help him reach the microphone properly. Louis climbed up with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. He looked out at the audience, his young face serious and composed. The ballroom fell completely silent. Even the soft clinking of glasses and whispered conversations ceased as everyone waited for the prince to begin. The prepared speech about hospital visits and toy donations was ready to roll off his tongue, just as they had practiced in the palace drawing room countless times. But something changed in Louis's expression as he stood there. His eyes swept across the assembled crowd, taking in the expensive jewelry, the designer gowns, the champagne glasses, and the elaborate decorations that had cost more than most families would see in a lifetime. The prepared words seemed to stick in his throat as a different thought took hold. The silence stretched on, becoming slightly uncomfortable. Catherine leaned forward in her chair, offering an encouraging smile. William's brow furrowed slightly as he noticed their son's hesitation. This wasn't part of the plan. The palace communications team, seated at a nearby table, began to show signs of concern. Louis gripped the edges of the podium with his small hands, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, but something deeper was stirring in his young mind. Earlier that day, he had overheard a conversation between two palace staff members about the cost of the evening's event. The numbers they mentioned were staggering, especially to a child who had recently learned about basic mathematics and money. The prepared speech felt wrong somehow. Standing before this glittering assembly, surrounded by luxury and opulence, the carefully crafted words about helping others seemed hollow. Louis had always been taught to be honest, to speak the truth, and to think about people who had less than he did. These lessons, drilled into him by his parents and tutors, suddenly collided with the reality of the moment. His young mind began to process the contradiction he was witnessing. Here were hundreds of people, dressed in clothes worth thousands of pounds, eating food that cost more than many families' monthly grocery budget, all gathering to talk about helping poor children. The irony wasn't lost on him, even at his tender age. The audience began to shift restlessly. What was meant to be a brief, sweet moment was turning into something else entirely. The palace staff looked increasingly worried, and Catherine started to rise from her seat, ready to intervene if necessary. The master of ceremonies prepared to step forward, thinking perhaps the young prince had forgotten his lines. But Louis hadn't forgotten anything. Instead, he had remembered something far more important than his prepared remarks. He thought about the homeless man he had seen during a recent drive through London, sleeping in a doorway, while people in expensive cars drove past without a second glance. He remembered the documentary he had watched with his nanny about children in other countries who didn't have enough food to eat. These images flashed through his mind as he looked out at the assembled wealth before him. The moment stretched on, tension building in the ornate ballroom. This was supposed to be a celebration, a feel-good evening where the royal family demonstrated their commitment to charitable causes. Media representatives present expected to file heartwarming stories about the young prince's first major public appearance. Instead, they found themselves witnessing something entirely unexpected. Louis's internal struggle was visible on his face. He was just a child, but he was a child who had been raised with a strong moral compass. His parents had taught him about compassion, about using his privileged position to help others, about the responsibility that came with being born into the royal family. These lessons now seemed to demand something different from him than what had been planned. The prepared speech lay forgotten in his mind as Louis made a decision that would change everything. He thought about the children who would never attend an event like this, who would never wear expensive clothes or eat fancy food. He thought about the distance between the world he inhabited and the world most people lived in, and he decided that honesty mattered more than protocol. Taking another deep breath, Louis leaned closer to the microphone. His voice, when it finally came, was clear and strong despite his youth. But the words that emerged were not the ones anyone expected to hear. They were not the carefully crafted, politically safe remarks that had been rehearsed and approved. Instead, they came straight from the heart of a child who had just realized something profound about the world around him. The audience, already on edge from the prolonged silence, leaned forward to catch his first words. Catherine and William froze in their seats, sensing that their son was about to deviate from the script. The palace staff held their collective breath, hoping against hope that whatever Louis said would be salvageable. What happened next will be talked about for years to come. In a moment of pure, unfiltered honesty that only a child could deliver, Prince Louis was about to say something that would shake the very foundations of royal public relations and challenge everyone in that room to think differently about wealth, privilege, and genuine charitable giving. The first words out of his mouth were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. And in that truth lay the power to either destroy carefully constructed images or to inspire real change. The ballroom held its breath, waiting to discover which it would be. As Louis opened his mouth to speak, the trajectory of the evening, and possibly much more, hung in the balance. The prepared remarks were forgotten, replaced by something far more dangerous and far more real. The young prince was about to learn that sometimes the most important words are the ones that aren't planned, and that truth, once spoken, cannot be taken back. The moment had arrived. Prince Louis, 8 years old, and suddenly feeling the full weight of his position and its responsibilities, prepared to say what no one in that glittering ballroom anticipated hearing. The silence was complete, the attention absolute, and the potential consequences enormous. In the space of that held breath, before the words that would change everything were spoken, the ballroom existed in a state of perfect suspension. It was the calm before the storm, The moment before truth collided with expectation, the instant before a child's honesty would challenge an entire system of carefully managed public appearances. What came next would be remembered long after the expensive gowns were returned to closets and the crystal glasses were cleaned and stored away. It would be the moment when Prince Louis taught a room full of adults something they had forgotten about: authenticity, compassion, and the courage to speak truth to power, even when you're only 8 years old. I don't understand why we're all dressed up in expensive clothes talking about helping poor children when we could have used this money to actually help them instead. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread throughout the ballroom with devastating effect. Prince Louis's young voice carried clearly through the microphone system, reaching every corner of the ornate room and every ear of the distinguished assembly. For a moment, nobody moved. The statement was so unexpected, so brutally honest, that it took several seconds for the full impact to register. Catherine's face went pale as she gripped the arms of her chair. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though whether from pride or panic, it was impossible to tell. The palace communications team looked as if they might faint collectively. But Louis wasn't finished. Having broken the careful barrier between public expectation and private truth, he continued with the fearless honesty that only a child could possess. My mummy and daddy taught me that when people are hungry, we should feed them. When people don't have homes, we should help them find places to live. But tonight, we spent enough money on this party to buy food for thousands of children, and instead we're just talking about how sad it is that they're hungry. The cameras, which had been positioned to capture a routine royal moment, were now recording something unprecedented. Photographers frantically adjusted their equipment, realizing they were witnessing history in the making. The television crews, initially planning to broadcast a brief, feel-good segment, found themselves documenting a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. In the audience, reactions varied dramatically. Some guests looked shocked, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Others appeared thoughtful, as if seeing their surroundings through fresh eyes. A few seemed angry, their faces flushing red with embarrassment or indignation. But many, perhaps more than anyone expected, began to nod slowly, recognizing the uncomfortable truth in the young prince's words. Lady Margaret Thornton, a prominent society figure known for her elaborate charity galas, felt a flush of shame creep up her neck. She thought about the hundreds of thousands of pounds spent on events like this one, money that could indeed have been sent directly to those in need. The irony had never occurred to her before, but now, through the eyes of an 8-year-old, it seemed glaring and impossible to ignore. Sir James Richardson, a wealthy businessman who attended such events more for social networking than charitable passion, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His Rolex watch suddenly felt heavy on his wrist, and he found himself calculating how many meals its cost could provide. The young prince's words had stripped away the comfortable distance between charitable intention and charitable action. Louis, emboldened by his decision to speak truthfully, continued with increasing confidence. His parents had taught him well about compassion and social responsibility, though they had never expected him to apply these lessons quite so publicly or dramatically. Last week, I saw a man sleeping outside in the cold. He was using newspapers as a blanket. I asked my nanny why he didn't have a house, and she said some people don't have enough money for homes. But look at this room. Look at all these beautiful things. If we sold just one of these chandeliers, that man could have a warm place to sleep for years. The comparison was simple, direct, and devastating in its clarity. Several guests instinctively looked up at the magnificent crystal chandeliers Louis had mentioned, perhaps calculating their worth for the first time. The ornate fixtures, which had always seemed like appropriate royal grandeur, suddenly appeared excessive under the scrutiny of childish logic. Catherine finally managed to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Louis, sweetheart," she began, but her son was on a roll now, his young passion unleashed. And all these fancy clothes. My suit cost more than some families spend on food for a whole month. I know because I heard the man talking about it when it was being fitted. He said the cost could feed a family of 4 for 6 weeks. But I'm only going to wear it for one night. The uncomfortable shifting in the audience became more pronounced. Designer gowns that had felt beautiful and appropriate an hour ago now seemed like monuments to excess. Jewelry that had been chosen to complement the formal atmosphere now felt like guilty secrets. The young prince's observations were forcing everyone to confront the disconnect between their charitable intentions and their actual choices. William stood up slowly, his training in crisis management warring with his pride in his son's moral clarity. He had spent years learning how to handle public relations disasters, but nothing had prepared him for a situation where his 8-year-old son was the source of both the crisis and, potentially, its solution. Louis noticed his father's movement, but continued undeterred. His young face was flushed with the excitement of finally saying what he felt needed to be said. I want to give a nice speech about helping sick children get toys. But standing here, looking at all this, I realized we're not really helping. We're just making ourselves feel better about having so much when other people have so little. The observation cut to the heart of charitable giving in high society, where elaborate fundraising events often cost nearly as much as they raised, but provided excellent opportunities for social networking and public recognition. Louis had identified the fundamental contradiction that many adults spent their entire lives avoiding. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, who had organized charity events for 40 years, felt tears prick her eyes. She had always told herself that these gatherings were necessary to raise awareness and encourage giving, but she had never questioned whether they were the most efficient way to help those in need. The young prince's words forced her to confront decades of self-justification. My teacher told us about a school in Africa where children learn sitting on the floor because they don't have desks or chairs. The cost of tonight's flowers could buy desks for all of them, but instead, the flowers will be thrown away tomorrow, and those children will still be sitting on the floor. The mention of the elaborate floral arrangements, which had indeed cost tens of thousands of pounds and would be discarded after the event, hit particularly hard. Several guests found themselves looking at the beautiful displays with new eyes, seeing waste where they had previously seen elegance. Louis's voice grew stronger as he continued, his confidence building with each honest observation. I think we should sell all these expensive things and give the money to people who actually need it. We could have this party in our backyard with sandwiches and juice boxes, and it would still be fun. Maybe it would be more fun because we'd know we were really helping instead of just pretending to help. The suggestion was so innocent, so practical, and so completely contrary to the established order of royal events that it left many guests speechless. The image of the royal family hosting a charity event with simple food in a modest setting, while directing all the saved expenses to actual charitable causes, was both appealing and revolutionary. Catherine finally managed to stand, her maternal instincts overriding her concern about protocol. She could see that Louis was becoming more animated with each statement, feeding off the energy of finally speaking his truth. While she was proud of his compassion, she was also acutely aware that every word was being recorded and would be scrutinized by media around the world. But before she could reach him, Louis delivered his most powerful statement yet. I know I'm just a kid, but I can see that something is wrong here. We say we love children, but we spend money on pretty things for ourselves instead of helping children who are hungry and scared and cold. How is that love? The question hung in the air like an accusation. It was unanswerable because it was fundamentally correct. The assembled crowd, many of whom had children and grandchildren of their own, suddenly saw themselves through the lens of pure moral clarity that only youth can provide. Dr. Sarah Chun, a pediatrician who worked with underprivileged children, felt her heart break and swell simultaneously. She had attended these events for years, always feeling slightly uncomfortable with the contrast between the luxury of the setting and the poverty of the children she served. Hearing a child articulate this disconnect with such clarity was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The young prince took a breath, seeming to gather himself for his final statement. The ballroom was completely silent now, every person hanging on his words, waiting to see how this unprecedented moment would conclude. I think real love means giving up things we want so other people can have things they need. And I think we should start doing that instead of just talking about it. With that, Prince Louis stepped down from the podium with the same dignity with which he had approached it. He walked back toward his parents, his small form moving through a silence so complete it seemed to echo. Every eye in the room followed his progress, and many guests found themselves seeing not just a young prince, but a mirror reflecting their own consciences. The aftermath of his words was immediate and electric. Some guests sat in stunned reflection, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own choices. Others whispered urgently to their companions, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Still others reached for their phones, knowing they had just experienced something that would change the conversation about wealth, charity, and social responsibility. Louis reached his parents and looked up at them with clear, bright eyes that showed no regret for what he had said. He had spoken his truth, and whatever came next, he had done what felt right in his young heart. The ballroom erupted into a chaos of whispered conversations, shocked exclamations, and the frantic activity of media representatives who knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The silence that followed Prince Louis's return to his seat was unlike anything the ballroom had ever experienced. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a profound truth has been spoken, when minds are reeling and hearts are being examined. Catherine reached for Louis's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze that conveyed both support and concern. William's face was unreadable, a mask of royal composure hiding the storm of emotions beneath. The master of ceremonies stood frozen at his position near the stage, his prepared transition to the next segment of the program forgotten. He had hosted hundreds of royal events, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. Protocol demanded he continue with the evening schedule, but human decency suggested that Prince Louis's words deserved acknowledgement, reflection, perhaps even response. Lady Victoria Pemberton, one of the event's primary organizers, felt her carefully planned evening crumbling around her. Months of preparation, countless meetings with palace staff, meticulous attention to every detail, all undone by the honest words of an 8-year-old. Yet as she looked around the ballroom, she began to notice something unexpected. Instead of the anger or embarrassment she feared, she saw something that might have been relief on many faces. The first person to stand was Dr. Michael Harrison, a renowned child psychiatrist who had worked in refugee camps around the world. His movement broke the spell of silence, and when he began to clap, slowly and deliberately, others gradually joined him. The applause was different from the polite appreciation that had greeted the earlier speeches. It was deeper, more thoughtful, tinged with recognition of something important that had just occurred. As the applause continued and grew, Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Not tears of embarrassment, but tears of pride. Her son had done something extraordinary. He had spoken truth to power in the most literal sense, and somehow, impossibly, many people were responding positively to his honesty. Mrs. Ruth Patterson, an elderly woman whose late husband had made his fortune in banking, rose slowly from her seat. At 86, she had attended more charity galas than she could count, but she had never heard anyone articulate what had been nagging at her conscience for decades. The young prince had given voice to questions she had buried under years of social expectation and habit. "The boy is right," she said loudly enough for those around her to hear. Her voice, though aged, carried the authority of someone who had lived long enough to recognize wisdom when she heard it. "We've been doing this all wrong." Her words sparked something in the crowd. Conversations began breaking out at tables throughout the ballroom, no longer whispered discussions of shock, but open debates about the issues Prince Louis had raised. The careful social protocols that usually governed such events began to dissolve as people found themselves engaged in discussions more real and meaningful than any they had experienced at a formal gathering. Lord Christopher Ashworth, a man who had inherited vast wealth and had always felt vaguely guilty about it, turned to his wife with an expression of wonder. "Did you hear what he said about the chandeliers? I've never thought about it that way before, but he's absolutely right. We could help so many people with what we spend on things like this." His wife, Lady Margaret Ashworth, nodded thoughtfully. She was remembering their daughter, who had gone through a phase of asking difficult questions about inequality before being gently discouraged from such topics as inappropriate for dinner conversation. Perhaps they had been wrong to silence those questions. Perhaps they needed to hear them more often. At the media table, journalists were frantically typing on their phones and laptops, trying to capture not just Prince Louis's words, but the unprecedented reaction they had sparked. Sarah Morrison, royal correspondent for a major newspaper, had covered the royal family for 15 years and had never seen anything like this. Royal events were usually predictable affairs with carefully managed messaging, but this was different. This was real. The palace communications team huddled in urgent discussion, trying to formulate a response to what had just occurred. Sir David Kellerman, the Queen's press secretary, was fielding phone calls from news organizations around the world, all wanting immediate comment on Prince Louis's speech. But what could he say? How do you spin truth? Meanwhile, Prince Louis himself seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just turned the royal establishment upside down. He sat quietly beside his parents, swinging his legs slightly in the way children do when their feet don't quite touch the floor. He appeared to be listening to the conversations around him with great interest, as if he was learning something important from the adults' responses to his words. Catherine leaned down to speak quietly in his ear. "Are you all right, sweetheart? Do you understand what just happened?" Louis looked up at her with those bright blue eyes that seemed older than his 8 years. "I think I made some people think about things differently," he said simply. "Is that bad?" "No, darling," Catherine replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not bad at all. It's actually quite wonderful." William, who had remained silent since Louis's speech, finally spoke. "Son," he said quietly, "what you just did took more courage than most adults show in their entire lives. I'm very proud of you." The words seemed to unlock something in the ballroom's atmosphere. Other conversations were becoming more animated, more passionate. Groups of guests who had never spoken before were finding themselves in deep discussion about wealth, responsibility, and the true meaning of charitable giving. Professor Janet Collins, who studied social inequality at Oxford, was explaining to a small group how much good could actually be accomplished with the money typically spent on events like this one. "The prince isn't wrong," she said earnestly. "If we took just half of what's spent on high-end fundraising events and applied it directly to charitable causes, we could triple the impact of our giving." Her words were overheard by others, creating expanding circles of discussion throughout the room. The formal structure of the evening had completely broken down, replaced by something more like a town hall meeting or academic symposium. Near the back of the ballroom, Marcus Thompson, a social worker who had been invited to represent one of the charities being honored, found himself surrounded by wealthy donors asking genuine questions about poverty, homelessness, and effective ways to help. For years, he had attended these events feeling like a token representative of the people they claimed to serve, but tonight felt different. Tonight, people seemed to actually want to understand and learn. "The young prince is absolutely right about directness," he explained to Lord and Lady Whitmore. "Every pound that goes directly to feeding someone, housing someone, or educating someone makes an immediate difference. When we spend money on events like this, we're essentially asking people to pay for the privilege of being asked to donate." The observation was sharp but fair, and it resonated with people who had never considered the mathematics of charity events. Lady Whitmore, who had organized dozens of fundraising galas, felt a shift in her thinking that was both uncomfortable and exhilarating. As these conversations continued and multiplied, the energy in the room began to change. What had started as shock was transforming into something more positive. Curiosity, engagement, even excitement about the possibility of doing things differently. Dr. Roberts, a child development specialist, was fascinated by what was happening. It took a child to see through the elaborate structures we've built around giving, she told a group of parents. Children see the world as it is, not as we've convinced ourselves it should be. That clarity is precious. Her words sparked a discussion about how adults often lose the ability to see simple truths, getting caught up in traditions and expectations that may no longer serve their intended purpose. Meanwhile, the practical concerns were mounting. The evening schedule had been completely abandoned. The planned dinner service, the dancing, the additional speeches, all forgotten in favor of these spontaneous discussions. The staff wasn't sure whether to continue with the formal program or adapt to this new reality. Catherine made the decision for them. Standing gracefully, she walked to the microphone that Lewis had used. The conversations gradually died down as people realized she was about to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Tonight, my son has given us all a gift. He has reminded us why we're really here and challenged us to think about whether we're living up to our own values. Rather than continue with our planned program, I propose we use this evening to have the conversations he has started." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval. For many in the audience, this was exactly what they wanted, a chance to process what they had heard and explore its implications. "I suggest we break into smaller groups and discuss practical ways we can make our charitable giving more effective and direct. Let's turn my son's challenge into action." The transformation was immediate and remarkable. The formal ballroom became a workshop space, with groups forming organically around different tables. People who had come to the event expecting polite conversation and predetermined outcomes found themselves engaged in the kind of meaningful dialogue many hadn't experienced in years. Prince Louis watched it all with fascination, beginning to understand that his words had not just shocked people, but had somehow freed them to have conversations they had wanted to have but hadn't known how to start. The evening was turning into something none of them had anticipated, but perhaps exactly what they all needed. 3 hours later, the ballroom looked completely different from the formal gathering that had begun the evening. Tables had been rearranged to facilitate discussion groups. Notepads and pens had appeared from purses and jacket pockets, and the atmosphere buzzed with an energy that no planned entertainment could have created. Prince Louis had inadvertently transformed a traditional charity gala into something unprecedented, a genuine working session on effective philanthropy. The results were extraordinary. Lady Margaret Thornton, who had initially felt embarrassed by Lewis's observations, was now leading a group focused on calculating the true cost-effectiveness of various charitable approaches. She had her phone out, working with Professor Collins to research direct giving organizations that could multiply the impact of their donations. "If we take the £200,000 typically spent on one of these events," she was saying, "and divide it between direct food aid, housing assistance, and educational programs, we could help approximately 1,500 families immediately rather than raising perhaps half that amount after expenses." The mathematics were stark and compelling. Sir James Richardson, the businessman who had felt uncomfortable about his expensive watch earlier in the evening, was now chairing a discussion about corporate charitable giving. "My company spends nearly £1 million annually on charity galas and corporate boxes at fundraising events," he admitted. "We tell ourselves it's necessary for networking and client relations, but young Prince Louis is right. We're really just finding expensive ways to feel good about giving money that could go directly to people who need it." His confession sparked similar admissions from other business leaders present. The conversation was turning into an unexpected group therapy session for wealthy people who had never been given permission to question the elaborate systems surrounding their charitable giving. Dr. Michael Harrison, the child psychiatrist who had been the first to applaud Lewis's speech, was working with a group of parents to discuss how to raise children with genuine social consciousness in a world of privilege. "Children naturally see inequality and want to fix it," he explained. "We train them out of this instinct by teaching them that there are appropriate ways to help that don't challenge their comfort or social status. Prince Louis reminds us what we lose when we do that. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, the veteran charity organizer, had tears in her eyes as she spoke with younger attendees about reimagining fundraising entirely. I've spent 40 years organizing events like this, always telling myself they were necessary. But tonight, I realize I've been more focused on creating beautiful events than on creating beautiful change. Her honesty was opening doors for others to examine their own motivations and methods. The conversation was difficult, but liberating, like a confession that had been decades in the making. Meanwhile, Catherine and William watched their son with growing amazement. Louis had moved from table to table throughout the evening, listening to the adult conversations with intense interest. He asked simple but profound questions that kept pushing the discussions deeper. Why do people want to dress up to help other people? He had asked one group, sparking a fascinating exploration of the psychology of giving and social recognition. If helping people is supposed to make you feel good, why does spending lots of money on parties to help people feel better than just helping people? He asked another group, cutting straight to the heart of performative charity. His questions were innocent, but devastating in their clarity. Adults found themselves explaining charitable traditions they had never questioned, only to realize they couldn't actually justify many of the practices they had accepted as normal. The media representatives present were documenting something unprecedented in royal history. This wasn't a scandal or a crisis. It was a transformation. Social media was exploding with clips of Louis's speech and photos of the impromptu working groups that had formed in the ballroom. The hashtags #PrinceLouisChallenge and #RealCharity were trending worldwide. But perhaps most remarkably, concrete action was already being planned. Lord Christopher Ashworth and his wife had decided to cancel their traditional Christmas charity ball and instead donate the entire budget directly to homeless shelters. "We'll host a simple potluck dinner instead," Lady Margaret announced to her group. "Everyone can bring a dish, and we'll spend the evening making care packages for people who need them." The idea was immediately adopted by several other couples. Traditional charity galas were being abandoned in favor of direct action programs. The shift was happening in real time. Mrs. Ruth Patterson, the elderly banking heiress, had become something of an unofficial leader among the older attendees. "I've been rich for 90 years, she declared to her group, "and I've been doing charity wrong for most of that time. This young man has shown me that I've been more interested in looking charitable than in being charitable." Her words carried weight because of her age and experience. If someone who had been philanthropic for decades could recognize the need for change, others felt permission to examine their own practices. The palace staff, initially panicked by the deviation from protocol, were now watching in fascination as their employers facilitated something genuinely historic. Sir David Kellerman, the press secretary, found himself fielding calls from charities around the world who had heard about the evening's events and wanted to know how they could participate in whatever was happening at Buckingham Palace. As the evening wound down, a spontaneous decision emerged from the various discussion groups. Rather than end the night, they wanted to continue meeting regularly to implement the changes they had discussed. Catherine suggested they use one of the palace's smaller reception rooms for monthly gatherings focused on effective charitable action rather than social fundraising. "We'll call them Louis Circles," suggested Dr. Roberts, the child development specialist. Working groups dedicated to direct, effective charitable action inspired by Prince Louis's challenge. The name stuck immediately. People were already pulling out their calendars to schedule the first official Louis Circle meeting. Prince Louis himself was getting tired. It was well past his usual bedtime, but he was clearly energized by everything that was happening around him. "Did I do something good?" he asked his mother as they prepared to leave. "You did something extraordinary, sweetheart," Catherine replied, scooping him up. "You helped all these adults remember what really matters." As the evening finally came to an end, the transformation was complete. Guests exchanged contact information not for social purposes, but to coordinate charitable activities. Business cards were being traded by people planning direct aid programs, not social events. The entire social dynamic had shifted. Lady Victoria Pemberton, who had organized the original gala, found herself planning something completely different for the following year. We'll have a simple reception with sandwiches and juice boxes, just like Prince Louis suggested, she told the remaining organizers. And we'll spend the whole evening packing care packages and making direct donations. No expensive flowers, no designer gowns, no elaborate entertainment, just people helping people. The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity, exactly the kind of change that Prince Louis's honesty had made possible. As news of the evening spread around the world, something remarkable began to happen. Other charity events started being canceled and replaced with direct action alternatives. The Prince Louis Challenge became a global movement, with wealthy individuals and organizations abandoning expensive fundraising events in favor of direct giving and hands-on volunteer work. 6 months later, the first annual report on the Prince Louis Challenge showed staggering results. The money saved from canceled galas, eliminated event costs, and streamlined charitable giving had helped more people than the traditional fundraising model had assisted in the previous 5 years combined. Prince Louis, now 9 years old, had no idea that his 8-year-old honesty had started a global revolution in charitable giving. To him, he had simply said what seemed obvious, that if you want to help people, you should spend your money helping people, not on parties to talk about helping people. But the adults who had been present that evening never forgot the moment when a child's clarity cut through decades of complicated justifications and social conventions. They had learned that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the youngest voices, and that truth, once spoken with courage, has the power to change everything. The ballroom at Buckingham Palace was restored to its original grandeur, but it was never quite the same. The chandeliers still sparkled, and the floors still gleamed, but everyone who saw them now also saw what Prince Louis had seen. Beautiful things that could be transformed into beautiful acts of genuine kindness and help. The evening had ended with shocked silence, but it began a new conversation that would continue for years to come. Prince Louis had indeed said what no one anticipated, and in doing so, had reminded everyone present what charity really meant. Not the elaborate performance of caring, but the simple, direct act of love in action.